weapons weren't banned because they failed. They were banned because they worked too well. And the line between military genius and war crime, it turned out to be razor thin. What you're about to discover isn't just a list of illegal weapons of war, it's the story of how far human beings pushed the limits of warfare. What happened when they crossed those limits, and why the world had to step in and say enough. Stay with me. Because some of these tactics were so effective, so devastating, that understanding them will permanently change how you think about strategy, power, and the real cost of victory. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong about the history of banned warfare. Most people believe that weapons and tactics get outlawed because generals sit in comfortable rooms and make ethical decisions. But the truth is far darker. The tactics and illegal weapons of war that eventually became banned were almost always outlawed after the world had already witnessed their catastrophic effects firsthand. Not before, after. The banning came from trauma, not foresight, and that distinction matters enormously. Take the story of chemical warfare in World War I. The year is 1915. The Western Front has become a grinding stalemate. Trenches stretch for hundreds of miles. Neither side can break through. And then on April 22nd, at a place called Ypres in Belgium, something changes forever. German forces release roughly 168 tons of chlorine gas along a 4-mile stretch of the Allied line. The yellowish-green cloud drifts toward French and Algerian troops. Within minutes, men are collapsing, gasping, drowning in their own fluid-filled lungs. The front line breaks, a 4-mile gap tears open, and for a brief moment, the Germans have an opportunity unlike any they've seen in months. But here is the part that almost nobody talks about. They didn't exploit it. German commanders hadn't fully anticipated the gap their own weapon would create. They had no ready reserves positioned to push through it. The most lethal innovation in that war's early history, and the side that used it hesitated long enough for the Allies to scramble a response. That strategic miscalculation didn't stop chemical weapons from spreading, though. By the end of World War I, both sides were deploying gas in various forms: chlorine, phosgene, and eventually the most notorious of them all, mustard gas. Unlike chlorine, mustard agent didn't just attack the lungs. It settled into the soil-contaminated equipment and caused blistering burns on any exposed skin. Soldiers who survived a gas attack often described losing their sight, their skin peeling, their throats closing. The suffering was prolonged. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to incapacitate, to flood enemy medical systems, drain morale, and terrorize. That psychological dimension was a deliberate part of the strategy. And that calculated terrorizing of human beings, not just the physical damage, is exactly what pushed world leaders toward the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. But here's what most people completely miss about that agreement: it banned the use of these weapons. Not the production, not the stockpiling. Nations signed the treaty while quietly keeping their arsenals intact, reasoning that the threat of retaliation was itself a deterrent. So the ban existed on paper, the weapons existed in warehouses. That tension would simmer for decades. Now here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. World War II brought a new category of war crimes history that still shocks researchers today. While the Western Allies largely honored the chemical weapons prohibition, at least in the European theater, other forms of strategic targeting crossed lines that had never been formally drawn before. Cities, civilian populations, economic infrastructure. These became targets not by accident, but by doctrine. Most people believed that strategic bombing was simply a blunt tool used because precision wasn't possible yet. But the truth is more complicated. In the early years of the war, British Bomber Command's Air Marshal Arthur Harris built an entire philosophy around what was internally called area bombing, deliberately targeting working-class housing near industrial centers to break German civilian morale. The logic was cold and calculated: destroy the homes, the community, the psychological stability of the workforce, and you destroy the industrial machine that feeds the war. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 has become the most debated example of this doctrine. Hundreds of aircraft, 2 waves of attacks separated by hours timed specifically so the second wave would strike as emergency responders were already on the ground. The resulting firestorm consumed a historic city. Civilian death estimates vary wildly in historical records, but the strategic value of the target itself has been questioned ever since. The war in Europe was already collapsing. Germany's defeat was weeks away. What makes this relevant to war crimes history isn't just the moral debate. It's that the Dresden bombings and similar attacks eventually shaped the development of international humanitarian law as it applied to civilian protection provisions that would be codified in the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. The world looked at what had been done and decided to write new rules. But that's not the full story of World War II's darkest strategic innovations. In the Pacific Theater, Japan employed a tactic that military historians still analyze with a strange mixture of horror and strategic fascination: the use of biological agents in warfare. Unit 731, a covert research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, conducted experiments in occupied China on a scale that was both systematic and industrialized. Bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid. These were weaponized and deployed against Chinese cities and populations. Porcelain bombs were engineered specifically to release plague-infected fleas. The goal wasn't just to cause casualties, it was to create cascading epidemics that would overwhelm a society from within, rendering military defense impossible. This represents one of the most chilling examples of biological warfare in war crimes history, not because of the scale alone, but because of the deliberate strategic thinking behind every step. The human cost was catastrophic, and the war crimes proceedings afterward were complicated by the fact that American authorities negotiated immunity for many Unit 731 researchers in exchange for the experimental data they had gathered. That moral compromise would haunt the international community for generations. What followed, the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, represented the strongest arms control agreement of the Cold War era. For the first time, nations didn't just ban the use of biological weapons. They committed to destroying existing stockpiles entirely. But verification was always the problem. You can inspect a missile silo. You cannot easily inspect a laboratory. So what actually happens when you push the limits of warfare beyond the physical into the psychological? Here's something the history books rarely frame this way. Some of the most effective and eventually banned or heavily regulated tactics in modern history weren't weapons at all. They were information operations. In World War II, both Axis and Allied powers used propaganda with such sophistication that it became a form of strategic warfare in its own right. But the deliberate spread of false information designed to incite ethnic violence or trigger civilian uprisings against specific groups crosses a legal threshold that international law now recognizes as a serious violation. The Rwanda genocide in 1994 brought this into devastating focus. Radio broadcasts. Radio broadcasts were used to coordinate mass violence against the Tutsi population. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda specifically prosecuted media figures for incitement, establishing a legal precedent that words themselves weaponized at scale can constitute a war crime. That ruling permanently changed how international law views information warfare. And in an age of social media and algorithmic amplification, that precedent has never been more relevant. Now let's bring this back to the physical battlefield and the weapon system that redefined the ethics of targeting entirely. Cluster munitions. These are weapons that release dozens or hundreds of smaller submunitions over a wide area. Militarily, they were designed to neutralize dispersed targets, troop formations, vehicle columns, airfields that a single bomb could never cover effectively. And for those tactical applications, they worked. The problem was the failure rate of those submunitions. Unexploded ordnance remained in fields, forests, and roads long after the fighting ended. Children found them, farmers plowed into them, communities built on top of them. In Laos alone, cluster munitions dropped during the Vietnam War era are still killing and injuring civilians today, decades after the conflict officially ended. The land itself became a long-term weapon. The 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions banned their use, production, transfer, and stockpiling. More than 100 countries signed. But several of the world's largest military powers, including the United States, Russia, and China, did not. That gap between the moral consensus and the strategic reality is one of the defining tensions in modern war crimes history. The ban exists, the weapons exist. Both are true simultaneously. And that tension between what the world agrees is wrong and what nations still choose to do is the thread that runs through every single example in this story. Chemical agents in World War I, firebombing doctrine in World War II, biological programs hidden behind secrecy, propaganda weaponized as a tool of elimination, munitions that keep killing long after the peace treaties are signed. The tactics that eventually get banned don't get banned because they fail. They get banned because they succeed in ways that the world ultimately cannot look away from. Every international law around illegal weapons of war was written in the aftermath of a specific horror. The horror came first, the rule followed. That is the pattern. That has always been the pattern. What we've covered here goes far beyond a simple list of banned weapons. It's really about the mechanism behind prohibition itself, how human beings repeatedly push strategy to its darkest edge, witness the consequences, and then try to write the rules backward. Chemical warfare, deliberate civilian targeting, biological programs, information operations, and persistent munitions all followed that same arc. The world didn't ban these tactics out of wisdom, it banned them out of grief. What I want to ask you, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments, is this: which of these banned tactics do you think still poses the greatest threat to civilians in modern conflicts, and why? If this kind of deep dive into military strategy and war crimes history is what you've been looking for, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss a new episode from the Strategist's Library. This was Eclipse History. I'll see you in the next one.